in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Sapio. This is Buck Joffrey, and today my guest is Dr. Nathan Price. He is on-leave professor at ISB, co-director of the Hood Price Lab for Systems Biomedicine, and served as associate director of the Institute from 2013 to 2020. He's currently chief scientific officer of Thorne Health Tech, and previously he was CEO of Longevity, an AI health intelligence company that merged with Thorne prior to its IPO in 2021. He's also the co-author of a book called The Age of Scientific Wellness: Why the Future of Medicine is Personalized, Predictive, Data-Rich, and in Your Hands. Dr. Price, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Buck. Thanks.
So you can tell offline, I was asking you a bunch of questions. You were like, when can we start the show? Because this is stuff that I'm pretty excited about, right down the alley of my message and what I'm hoping people kind of, start thinking the way people, change their paradigm. Let's start with this. What inspired you to sort of focus on the intersection of this health technology, personalized medicine world?
Yeah, so I came at this really from kind of a rigorous academic science background and had spent a lot of time doing the traditional things that you might do, like, a cancer researcher, a Alzheimer's researcher, kind of in that space. And I really just became convinced that the way that we were going about the scientific and research and medical enterprise was backwards, in the sense that we were intervening much too late. We would come in after there were these terrible symptoms. And by then you have hundreds or thousands of different things have happened in the body, and trying to put that back together is incredibly challenging. It's very worthwhile. It's useful, obviously, but it's not the place you'd like to start. So rather than like slowing the decline of Alzheimer's by for a few months, can we figure out how to go much, much earlier and understand, well, what's happening 10, 20 years in advance, where we can stop those processes when they're small? And can we give people a really expanded view of what they can have as a health span? So that just became a big passion of mine.
Why don't you define health span? We've talked about it a little bit before, but it is a term that sort of, I hadn't heard in years, and all of a sudden it's part of the common nomenclature. So
yeah, it's really become more popular in recent years.
Right.
So health span is basically just the idea of how long do you live a healthy, robust life. An interesting way to think about this that I really like. I was going up to actually up to RPI to give a lecture on this future of medicine, and I was listening to a book. Not a recent book. This book is like 2,000 years old. It was written by Seneca.
Okay.
And just by total coincidence, I'm driving up, up there. And by coincidence, there's these letters that I'm on, like letter 75 or something. And it's like longevity. So he starts talking about longevity. And the quote that he had that I really liked was that the key is that you want to extend your life and not your death.
Yes.
And to me, that's what health span is about. You're trying to, because a lot of people, if you talk about longevity, they'll say, I don't want to live a long time. They say, I don't want to live old. But why? Because they're imagining that horrible end of life that so many of us face, that we don't really want extended. So the idea is we don't want to extend death. We want to extend life. And a focus on what we call scientific wellness is the effort to extend life. Whereas a lot of your late care, stage disease, you could argue you're really kind of extending your death.
Yeah, and I think that is a very doable thing too, which I think it should be encouraging to people. I think that we have a lot of the tools right now, which you're going to which you're working on, that make that possible. So, okay, so maybe you don't live to 150, and maybe that isn't going to happen in the next 20 years. I think it might, who knows? But at the very least, you can focus on taking your 85, 90 years and making it a true 80 years, and and have that decline really in the last year or two, as opposed to dragging out over a decade or decade and a half.
Yeah, that's right. And that's something that's very doable, right now. There's some luck involved, right? Some genetics, but that's on the table for most people. Like you, I also think even if we can extend lifespan out to 150, 100, if that turns out to be possible, we still want that to be the extension of health span.
Right.
So But Healthspan is a little bit separated from the notion of just how far that endpoint can be pushed out.
I want to talk a little bit about the concept of biological age, because I think it, from what I gather, it's sort of at the core of a lot of what you're doing over there, what you're looking at, even with artificial intelligence. How is biological age different from chronological age, and even I guess if you from some of these biological age tests, what are you looking at when you are specifically referring to biological age?
Yeah, I'm really happy to talk about that because it's often a confusing and controversial topic at times. So for the way I think about aging primarily, well, let's talk first. Chronological age is just the number of times you've gone around the sun, right? We all are very well aware of what that is. Aging, in terms of biological aging, is more a process of damage. Mm-hmm. That can happen at variable rates. And one of the ways that I like to think about that is, to me, the most practical definition of aging is that every year you're alive, the probability that you will die in the next year ticks up. So if aging were eliminated, for example, that wouldn't be immortality or anything like that.
Right.
But what that would mean is that line would be flat. In other words, that when you were 80, you had the same relative rate of odds of dying as you did when you were 20. That would be like a flattening. Right. So if you think about biological age that way, as this process of damage, then it becomes very obvious that it can be moved forward or backward, or that you can have an effect on it. And so biological age then is very related to just being healthier at your same chronologic age. And so some people will fight over those definitions. To me, they kind of mean the same thing.
Right.
The one other thing I'll say about biological age is sometimes it can be sensationalized. And right now, when people talk about reducing biological age, we are talking about essentially improving health, right? So that the forecast of how many years you have ahead is better. We're not yet at a period where there's anything credible about what I would call, just like an AI, like we had weak AI and strong AI. You could think about that as weak biological age is kind of this health element, and strong biological age would be, that would be more when you see, Michael Jordan comes back to the NBA, right? And he's a young guy, going again. And so there are those dreams of getting there. But I think we have to separate that in our mind. So biological age today is health related.
When you look at biological age and you're testing for biological age, I guess the question I have is, what is the specific substrate that you're looking at? Are you looking at inflammatory signals and lipid profiles and insulin sensitivity, or are you looking at DNA methylations? Things in the genetic, with the genome that might suggest various aging patterns, or is it sort of both? How are you guys approaching it?
Yeah, there's a few different ways you can go about this. So there's the epigenetic clocks, right? Epigenetic ages that are very commonly used, looking at methylation patterns. Right. Steve Horvath really pioneered that, and that's quite commonly used. The way that we've done it at Thorne, we did not choose to go that route. We instead use clinical lab measures, which are more based on the kind of things you mentioned, your lipid levels, your hemoglobin A1C,
sure,
like a lot of the things that you monitor. We did it that way because, at least today, of the molecular measurements of biological age, that's the one that's most associated with your health outcomes.
With Healthspan.
And we also know how to, with Healthspan, and we know how to interpret them too. So it gives you not just an age, but a plan of action of how you can make it better. So from a molecular standpoint, that is the method that I favored and why we built the test the way we did at Thorne. The third way, though, which ultimately I think is the strongest, if you're really looking at, is our functional tests. So there you're really looking at things like your VO2 max, your scale, your strength, your lack of muscle wasting, you could do it on many axes, right? Your eyesight, but it's kind of this holistic view. And so my point of view is that all the stuff that we do molecularly to try to target or have interface, when you actually care about it the most, of course, is does it affect that, the functions in your body in a way that it really makes you feel younger, feel healthier, feel like you can do a lot more than you could before.
You mentioned the Horvath clock and epigenetic aging and that kind of thing. One of the things that I think is fascinating about those is the correlation or predictive value of those numbers is actually pretty high. And so the question is, when you look at the way you're looking at, say, biological age and some of these other ways of assessing health, do you have pretty good data to suggest that those are, predictive of health span, or are we just assuming because, people who live longer and healthier lives have better biological, better lab studies?
Yeah, in some cases we have a pretty good sense of that. So you can go into these databases where you have like lots of bank blood samples, so the outcome like years in advance. Those studies have been done where people had looked at least based on the clinical lab measures and against like the epigenetics. That was kind of what I was referring to when that had been shown more to be related to clinical outcomes. Mm-hmm. For some of the clinical labs, we also have just individually a lot of data, that support that. Another thing that we did is we took this company that I co-founded some years ago called Aravale. Mm-hmm. We took people through a health program for 4 years. And in that population, we were able to show that as they went through a wellness program aimed at improving their health, that their biological ages as measured, from these labs, that they actually improved on that biological age metric by 1.16 years per year relative mm-hmm. to their chronologic age. Women did particularly well. They got better at 1.5 years per year. Men got better at 0.8 years per year. So there we were actually able to see that when you did an active intervention, that you could in fact see those things change and go down.
Yeah, the only tricky thing
Not
about
long enough
that
to see longevity, but
right,
you could see health improve.
I would think the only thing that's kind of tricky in interpreting that data, and maybe you're just, and I don't want to belabor this, but I'm so curious about it myself, is, okay, you take somebody like me, and I've been, for several years, been artificially suppressing my lipids, just with this idea that, if I get my ApoB below 60, there's a good chance I'm not going to die of cardiovascular disease. So, I'm one of those people. So I guess one of the questions is, if you're artificially suppressing those things, can you assume that it has the same meaning as...
No.
Right.
Absolutely. In fact, this was one of the things we worried about a lot.
Right.
So one was that when we were establishing the measures, we would exclude anything. So in other words, if you're supplementing, let's say on a particular value, there's a good maxim that as soon as something becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Right. Exactly. Really yeah.
And that's why I was tying back before to those functional assays.
Yes.
Because what I really think is that the molecular data should be used as a guidepost to tell you things that are probably useful to do. But I don't actually believe in a deep way that only seeing a molecular measure change, especially if you can artificially suppress it with a drug or inflate it with a supplement or whatever. I don't believe that unless doing those things has an effect in a system, and especially on function that you can see and you can't fake.
Yeah.
Right. So that I very much agree with you on that, because as soon as if you can artificially manipulate it, it's not meaningful. So
let's talk about the role of AI in all of this. Obviously, again, looking at epigenetic clocks and all that, that's very much on that. Are you using the AI ultimately in the same way to look at large populations of people with various, lab profiles and seeing how old they are? Is that kind of how you do the biological age in the first place?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways that I'll answer that. So one is in terms of the biological age. That's pretty much done the way that the most people would do it. It's essentially a machine learning against large clouds of data against aging. And then you look at the differences, whether it's higher or lower, and then you compare that against disease case. So in our case, we look to see if we had people that had higher biological age than chronological age, was that really associated with disease? And in our case, every single disease for which there was a statistically significant signal, in every case they had higher biological age rather than lower. So on average, we saw that strongly. The flip side is what I already mentioned, that we saw biological age was improved by positive health interventions. The other element I'll say on the AI side, though, is the biological algorithm calculation itself, I would say, is machine learning or a function. I wouldn't, other than, marketing folks sometimes call them AIs, but I wouldn't really call them AIs.
Yeah.
Where we get a lot more into AI is some of the deeper science stuff that we've been involved in. So we did a partnership with a company over the last 3 years focused on building digital twin models for brain health, for example. That actually gets very sophisticated because it's a physiologic model of how the brain maintains health. And you can, in fact, take blood measures and genetics and forecast likely age of onset of dementia, and you can simulate different intervention strategies and then simulate what the forward course of that person's life would likely look like under all those different intervention strategies and choose the best one.
Really?
That's a sophisticated kind of AI. And also in my scientific work, I'm really pushing forward on a notion that we call the N of 1 analyzer. And what this is, and this is earlier research. So this stuff, some of the stuff I talked about before is a product. This is not yet.
Yeah.
But the point here is that what lots of people do, ourselves included, we probably have 100 papers on this, where you can take large amounts of this, omics or large scale health data, right? You can machine learn it. You can find all kinds of patterns. We've published tons and tons on that we could talk about. But what we want to do with the N of 1 analyzer is something different. This is to say, if I have a huge amount of data about you, what can I say about your health? And this is actually a very different question. It's informed by the other one, but it's very, very different. I just finished.
No. Is this related to the
federal government to do this?
But, the Phenomics? Is that what Phenomics is all about? Okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I just want to interrupt you.
Yeah, this is what Phenomics is about. If we talk about that, right? And that's a word that really isn't in common usage. But if we talk about deep phenotyping or deep phenomics, this is the notion that I can measure thousands, millions, you can even say billions if you count all the letters in the genome of different data points for a person. And this is centered on, first, identifying what's atypical or what unusual about you. So in other words, if there's like one of the really great statistics for people to, or properties of statistics for people to understand is there is no average, right? There is no average human being. A great stat that I love about this, I'll come back to basketball again, but they were just looking at LeBron James's career, right? And he has, like, his average game is 27 points and 9 assists and 9 rebounds, something like that. And then they asked the question, how many times has he had his average stat line? And the answer is never, not once, not one time in 20 years has that happened.
Yeah.
So there is no average. So every single person, when you look at them, especially when you have many dimensions, right? That was 3 dimensions. If you're looking at many, many dimensions, we all have this massive amount of differences that are happening in our body that has not actually ever happened before, ever. And so what this thing does is that it goes through and it evaluates all of the properties of these data that are unusual in you relative to a healthy population that's, say, around your same age, and maybe corrected some for ethnicity, or that, that's even not a great correction, but corrected for genetics, right? Your genetic background or whatever. And so you do all that kind of thing. And then what you can do now with modern AIs is you can start to build what I call a mechanistic reasoner, which means that it's not pattern matching. What you're trying to do is take, because we know a lot about the functions of these proteins or what these metabolic systems are, or what they're doing. And we have these massive maps of how that relates into disease. So what we want to do is to build a capability where you can assess all of those things that are deviating. And especially if you have a longitudinal profile, right? You're going along healthy, and all of a sudden you see these jumps in different molecules and different processes. They're all of a sudden in a very different state than they were before. Those are clues about what's happening in advance of developing terrible disease downstream. Right. And we want to see the degree to which you can tap those back. Yeah. And it's not only theoretical. We have published papers where, for example, when we ran this wellness program with Aravale, this earlier company I mentioned, And 3 of those individuals got metastatic cancer, sadly, during that process. But we were able to identify signals that were 2 years in advance of diagnosis that jumped up. One simple molecule I'll mention is something called CCAM5. It's a known marker of metastasis in late stage cancer patients, but what wasn't known was that it pops up years in advance. And we only observed it in the 3 people, right? And so that's a small number, but we had data on thousands of other people and it didn't pop up at all in them. So it was, we only observed it there. So you'd want more validation.
So you went back, I mean, obviously you didn't know it had predictive value at the time. Otherwise,
we didn't.
You would have done something about it. But you can go back.
Well, although legally we would not have been able to give that information.
Yeah.
Legally we would not be allowed to.
That's kind of messed up. But on the other hand,
we could have a whole section on pros and cons of various protections.
But that's part of that whole machine learning thing, right? Like ultimately, you're able to look back and say, well, gosh, there were these biological things that popped up in these individuals, and that's where like this whole paradigm is so much different than modern medicine, right? I mean, we look at modern medicine, as we call it, which really is the same medicine we've been using with higher levels of technology for the last 100 years, is really based on sort of big numbers, big populations, big studies, when we know in reality, individuals are, like you said, there's no average of us. So it's always in our best interest, to not look at ourselves as big numbers, right? To focus on this kind of, micro level.
Yeah, and there's a lot you can dive into. And one thing I'll say back on the predictive level.
Yeah.
In the cancer case, yeah, that's true. We had to look backwards. There were a number of cases, though, where we did, where we could make, even if we couldn't make specific predictions, by monitoring all this data, like one person, for example, and I won't get it too much in the weeds on this, but going through, all of a sudden we're monitoring her markers, and all of a sudden they jump like pretty dramatically. So at that stage, because we haven't done all the machine learning, like we don't actually know what the problem is, but her data were kind of screaming that something was happening. Like her cortisol levels, were, kind of followed a normal trajectory through the day. We're now like almost backwards. She had, anyway, there was all these jumps and changes. And that's what we see in advance of disease, that the number of networks that you might characterize as being, in this atypical state, like start amplifying. Yeah. And in her case, we got her to go into her physician. And anyway, there was kind of a long story because they kind of wrote her off at first, but eventually she was able to get to the source, ended up getting a colonoscopy, and she had a stage 3, just pre-metastatic tumor about the size of your palm. Wow. In her colon that they were able to, she credited that with saving her life. Wow. Because she was unaware of that symptomatically. She didn't know that. She didn't, it wouldn't have gone in otherwise. Anyway, we have many, many examples like that, but there are lots of these. So even at the early stages, when you start monitoring yourself, you get a sense, even from just looking at the time dynamics and the divergences, you start to have a sense that, something that's not normal is happening. So now, obviously, I'm at Thorne, but, we have programs that are looking into the future that are ongoing that people, can get access to if they want to. But if you want to be able to monitor your microbiome and the amount of health information you can get out of a microbiome is just radically better than it was 5 years ago. And so the science has been getting better, the depth of what you can find out. And the gut microbiome has big impact on health, and we've published very extensively on this now. Or if you want to monitor a lot of molecules out of your blood, like you can do hundreds of those if you'd like. You can get those in some detail. You can get recommendations on actions to take as a function of that, all geared towards how do you optimize your health span, right, and try to have as good a trajectory as possible. So we try to provide paths for people to do that, and that's what I'm always working on.
So let's kind of like finish this out by, I think a lot of people, including myself, are very interested in checking out sort of the different things that you can do. First of all, you don't need a physician to write a prescription for a lot of the things you're talking about. So first of all, like, where do you go to order these kinds of things? And then maybe you can give us sort of an overview on the types of things that are available.
Sure. Yeah. So so certainly for my company, it's Thorne.com, and that's THORNE.com. People want to look for that. Like I mentioned, there's a gut health test, which is measuring the microbiome, which are these thousands of microbes that live in your gut, and they have profound effects because everything you take into your mouth, whether it's food, a supplement, a drug, these are all have the potential to be metabolized and changed by your microbiome. So understanding what it's doing can be a really important aspect to health. We do have a biological age test that's based on 40 different clinical labs. So it'll be a lot of familiar markers, but then it's just analyzed under the context of kind of your current age, and sex matters a lot for that as well. We also have some high performance tests. These were formerly with the company Wellness FX that we acquired a couple of years ago, that have been folded in now with Thorne. So they give you the highest level panel. You can get hundreds of markers to really monitor many aspects of health. They all come with reports that will guide people through a lot of detail about what's under there that you can dive into, but also a simple page of recommendations of things that, based on analysis of the data, we think would make a positive difference to a person's health. Our favorite way for this to happen is that people take a test, do the recommendations, take the test again, see if it in fact changed the things that we said it would change.
Right.
And we love to see that because it's we think that helps gain trust with people that are going on this journey with us. And it's also very useful from my side on the data side, because we love to analyze where it worked, and you're never 100% right. So where it didn't, how can we make better recommendations and so forth? So we're always building out that engine. And then Thorne, which many of your listeners will probably know, but Thorne is really well known supplement company. There was an independent review earlier this year. I think they rated them number one for quality, or us number one for quality. I have a tendency to say them because I don't make it's not
because you don't make them right.
Personal ownership. I feel like I admire the team that does. So I say they're great at it, but I don't actually do that. But
Got it.
I should. But I do work for the company now, so that's, it's different.
Is there some genetic testing too, or no? Is that part of the biological? We don't do genetic testing right now at Thorne directly. It is something that I am very interested in part because there's a certain kind of use of genetics that I really believe in strongly, and doesn't exist in the market today. As you can tell, I really want to build. But that is the notion, and we proved this. This is what we did from the Aravale data. But what we showed was that if you were taking people through a wellness program, for example, and let's say one of the things they wanted to change, they wanted to lower their LDL cholesterol, right, as a proxy for improving their outlook for cardiovascular disease. What we saw was that, so most studies look at this, and you'll find that you can have this modest effect by lifestyle. Some people change, some people don't, and that's kind of where studies are. But because we had this wealth of data, we could look in there and see that actually you could predict in advance who would lower it a lot and who wouldn't. And the key was genetics. So if your genetics predicted that you'd have low LDL cholesterol, but you were high, i.e. there was a gap, those people could lower their LDL cholesterol very significantly by lifestyle intervention. But if their genetics predicted they were high, and they were high, i.e. there was no gap, we saw no statistically significant ability for that group to change at all. And so that meant, what that means then is that the degree to which at least a lot of these biomarkers are changeable is predictable from your genome. And that is a category of variable that we find to be incredibly useful, that is not used to any significant degree across all of medicine today. And it's an entirely new category of analysis that I'm a big believer in, and I really want to build. I
don't build it. Someone on the call beat me to it, right? But we need to build.
There's so many useful things out there. I mean, even like if you look at the Boston Heart stuff and trying to determine whether your diet can actually change your lipids or not. For me, there's these low-hanging fruit from the clinical side that it drives me crazy that are, everybody can't have. I mean, I know that I have a mutation in the MTHFR gene, and 30% of the population has that, right? And it increases homocysteine. And all I have to do is take a methylfolate supplement, and it's gone, and decreases my risk of cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative disease. It's sort of maddening, frankly.
And there's a lot of those, right? Like vitamin D is a good example. Yep. There are 6 known variants that block uptake of vitamin D. And when we looked in our population, and we did a very simple model, like the simplest model possible. We just counted the number of those variants that they had, and you graph them. And the amount of vitamin D in the blood is highly predicted by just counting the number of those variants that a person has. And so, and then even after we found that 90% of people in what we call the Pioneer 100 study, which was kind of the first big study that launched all of this, were deficient in vitamin D, even after supplementation by a lot of them, it was interesting. We reran the analysis, now confounded for the reasons we mentioned before. Yeah. But that slope was it was spot on again. It was kind of amazing. Yeah. Yeah, and it really makes a difference.
Well, fascinating stuff. I could talk to you forever, but I do appreciate you taking the time to come on and tell us a little bit about what you're doing over there. Also, the book is The Age of Scientific Wellness, Why the Future of Medicine is Personalized, Predictive, Data-Rich, and in your hands. And I guess we just scratched the surface on that, right?
A lot more in there, yeah, exactly. But it'd be down this avenue.
Well, Nathan, I really do appreciate you being on, and would love to have you on again sometime.
Happy to do it. Thanks a lot, Buck. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.